"I'm your bride," she said, standing at his door with a carpetbag and mud on her boots. Her chin lifted like she wasn't terrified out of her mind. Caleb Mercer hadn't spoken to a woman in 15 years. He stood in his doorway, one hand still gripping the axe he'd been carrying, staring at the stranger on his porch like she'd dropped out of the sky. He hadn't written to anyone. He hadn't asked for anything. He had spent 15 years making peace with being alone. And now this. If this story already has you hooked, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The axe was the first thing she noticed, not the man holding it. Though he was hard to miss, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the way that men get when they've spent years working under a hard sky with no one to soften the edges. No. The first thing Clara Whitfield noticed was the axe still swinging slightly at his side, like he'd been mid-swing when she knocked and hadn't quite decided yet whether to put it down. She knocked again, even though he was right there. It was the only thing she could think to do. "I heard you the first time," he said. His voice was rough-low, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long while. "Then you heard me say I'm Clara Whitfield." She kept her chin up. She'd practiced that on the train. Keep your chin up. Don't let them see you flinch. "I've come from Chicago. I'm here for Caleb Mercer." Something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly. More like the way a man looks when he hears a sound he can't place and doesn't like. "I'm Caleb Mercer," he said. "Then I'm your bride," she said again. The silence that followed was the longest she'd ever stood in. Even longer than the silences she'd grown up with, the cold, punishing kind that her father used when he didn't want to bother explaining why he was disappointed in her. This one was different. This one was bewildered. "I don't have a bride," he said finally. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the letter. The paper was soft at the folds, from how many times she'd opened and reread it on the train, checking the address, checking the name, making sure she hadn't misread anything in her exhaustion. She held it out to him. He didn't take it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he knows is trouble before he even touches it. "Read it," she said. "I know what it says." "You wrote it." He looked at her, then really looked the kind of look that takes stock rather than just registers. She was younger than he'd expected someone to be who'd traveled this far alone. 20-something, dark circles under her eyes, a small cut on her lower lip that she'd probably gotten from the wind or from biting it too hard during the last leg of the journey. She was frightened he could see that clearly enough, but she was working very hard not to be. "I didn't write it," he said. Clara felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Not literally, though the altitude out here made everything feel slightly unsteady, but in the deeper way, the way it shifted when you realized the solid thing you'd been standing on was actually hollow. "What?" she said. "I said I didn't write that letter." "Your name is on it." "A lot of people know my name." She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them moved. "Then there's been a mistake," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, steadier than she felt. "There's been a mistake," he agreed. She looked past him into the cabin at the dim interior, the single lamp burning low on a table, the silence radiating out from the place like heat from a stone wall. 15 years of silence, she didn't know that yet. But she felt something of it even then, the weight of a space that had held only one person for a very long time. "I have nowhere to go," she said. Not asking, not begging, just stating the fact of it clean and plain, the way you say the sky is gray when the sky is gray. Caleb looked out past her at the road. The wagon that had brought her from town was already gone. A distant clatter fading into the valley below. The afternoon light was going thin and cold. He knew these mountains at night. He knew what they did to people who weren't prepared for them. He stepped back from the doorway. "You stay tonight," he said. "That's all." Clara had been many things in her 24 years. A daughter briefly, a seamstress's apprentice, a girl who read too many letters from the agency's catalog when she should have been sleeping, She had been accused of things she hadn't done, and believed things that turned out to be false, and trusted people who had no business being trusted. But she had never been inside a room this quiet. The cabin was one large space divided by habit rather than walls. A sleeping area on one side, a working area on the other. Everything worn and functional, and entirely without softness. No curtains, no extra chair. One cup hanging from a nail beside the window, because one cup was all that was needed. She sat at the table with her carpetbag on the floor beside her feet, and watched him build up the fire without speaking. He moved economically, no wasted motion, the kind of movement that came from years of doing something alone with no one watching, and no performance required. "Were you expecting someone?" she asked. She had to ask. The silence was going to swallow her. "No." "Then who sent that letter?" "Someone forged your name. Someone paid the agency fee. Someone arranged for a wagon to bring me from town." He set the iron poker back against the wall and turned to face her. "I don't know," he said. "You must have some idea." He was quiet for a moment in the way that men sometimes are when they know something and are deciding whether it's worth saying. "Jonas Miller," he said at last. "Who is Jonas Miller?" "Old friend. Hasn't been here in 2 years." A pause. "He thinks I need—" He stopped. "He thinks you need a wife," Clara said. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "He thinks a lot of things." "Where is he now?" "Town, maybe. He moves around." Clara pressed her palms flat on the table. Her hands were cold. She'd been cold since Colorado, probably. "Then tomorrow morning you'll take me to town, and we'll find Jonas Miller and sort this out. Town is 4 hours by wagon. Then we leave at first light." Something almost shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, she didn't think his face did that easily anymore, but an acknowledgement maybe. Of her steadiness. Of the fact that she hadn't crumbled yet. "First light," he agreed. He gave her the bed. He didn't offer it. He just pulled an extra blanket from the chest at the foot of it and set it on top and moved his own bedroll to the floor by the fire without discussion. She lay on top of the covers in her dress, too tired to argue and too wary to fully undress, and listened to him settle into the quiet. The fire crackled. Wind moved through the pines outside. She thought about Chicago, about the cold water flat she'd shared with 2 other girls from the factory, about the smell of machine oil that she couldn't ever quite get out of her hair, about the man who had accused her of something she hadn't done and made it impossible to stay. She thought about the agency's letter, the one that had seemed like a door opening just when every other door was shutting. A rancher in Utah. 35 years old, the letter said. Steady work. A good man by all accounts. She'd believed it because she needed to believe something. "What was her name?" she asked into the darkness. A long pause. "What?" His voice came from the floor even lower than before. "Your wife. I can tell someone lived here who isn't here anymore. What was her name?" Another silence. Longer this time. She thought he wasn't going to answer. "Sarah," he said. Just the one word. But the weight inside it was enormous. The kind of weight that a name picks up when it's been carried alone for 15 years with nowhere to set it down. "I'm sorry," Clara said. He didn't answer, but something in the room shifted barely perceptibly, like the way pressure changes before weather comes in. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. In the morning, he had coffee ready before she was fully awake. He set a cup on the table, without asking whether she wanted it, and went back to whatever he was doing outside. She drank it standing up, looking around the cabin in the gray early light, seeing things she hadn't been able to see the night before. A shelf above the window with 3 books on it. A Bible, a surveyor's manual, and a worn volume of Tennyson that seemed wrong in the space too delicate, like it belonged somewhere else. A pair of women's gloves folded neatly on the shelf beside the books. She didn't touch them. She recognized what they were. He came back inside for his hat and found her looking at the shelf. "Wagon's ready," he said. All right. She picked up her carpet bag. Leave it, he said. You'll come back for it either way. She set it down. She didn't ask what he meant by either way. She thought she understood it, and it made her stomach feel strange, like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Vendettas. The road down the mountain was narrow and punishing, and Caleb drove without speaking. Clara sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape open up below them. The valley spread out gray-gold in the morning light, smoke rising from a settlement in the distance. She'd thought it was beautiful from the train window. Up close, it felt enormous and indifferent, the kind of beautiful that didn't care whether you were there to see it or not. How long have you been here? She asked. Somewhere around the first hour, she decided that silence between two strangers heading into a difficult situation was worse than conversation. Came out in '68, he said. 15 years. Alone the whole time. His hands tightened slightly on the reins. After 71. She did the math. 14 years approximately. He'd said 15 last night. Close enough. The ranch, she said. Is it working? I mean, does it? It works, he said. I wasn't questioning your competence, she said. I was making conversation. He glanced at her sideways, and this time she saw it more clearly, not a smile, but the shadow of one, the memory of how it worked. Cattle, he said. About 200 head. I move them down to the lower pasture in winter. Do you have help? Hired hands in spring and fall, otherwise no. 200 head of cattle, she said. Alone. It's not as strange as you're making it sound. I'm not making it sound like anything. I'm just... She stopped. I grew up in a city, she said instead. I don't know anything about cattle. You don't need to, he said. You're not staying. The flatness of it landed harder than she'd expected. Not cruel, he wasn't a cruel man. She'd already determined that, just honest, in the way that people get when they've spent a long time with no one to soften things for. No, she agreed. I'm not staying. Jonas Miller wasn't in town. Of course he wasn't. The man at the post office knew him. The woman at the general store knew him. The barkeep at the one saloon knew him by name, and by the particular habit he had of ordering whiskey, and then nursing it for 2 hours while he talked to whoever would listen. But nobody had seen him in 3 weeks. He said he was heading up toward the Mercer place. The barkeep offered, leaning on his counter studying Caleb with the careful attention of a man who hasn't seen his neighbor in a long while and is noting the changes. Had some idea he was doing you a favor. Clara watched Caleb's face close down. He is not doing me a favor, Caleb said. What kind of favor? Clara asked the barkeep. The man scratched the back of his neck and glanced at Caleb. Well, he said you'd been up there long enough. Said a man needed... That's enough, Caleb said. The barkeep went quiet. Clara turned to look at Caleb. He said a man needed what? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Someone used your name to bring a woman across 4 states. The least I deserve is to know why. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the saloon's single window and put shadows under his cheekbones, and she realized, not for the first time, that he was not an ugly man. He was a man who had stopped thinking about such things, stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping enough, stopped allowing himself to want anything. But underneath all that neglect was someone who might once have laughed without effort. Jonas thought I was dying, Caleb said at last. Not from sickness, just from the quiet. Clara held very still. And was he right? She asked. Caleb turned and walked back out into the street without answering. Tame. She had a choice to make. The stagecoach east came through twice a week. The next one was in 2 days. She had $11 in her coat pocket, enough for a ticket to Denver barely, and after that she'd be starting over with nothing in a city she didn't know. Escaping a past she couldn't outrun, heading toward a future she couldn't picture. Or she could go back up the mountain. She stood outside the general store while Caleb loaded supplies into the wagon bed and thought about it with the cold, clear logic of a woman who had learned the hard way not to make decisions with her heart. $11. Denver. Starting over. Or a cabin in the mountains with a man who hadn't touched a woman in 15 years and hadn't asked for one and hadn't pretended to be glad she was there. He looked up from the wagon and found her watching him. "Stage comes through Thursday," he said. "If that's what you're thinking." "I know," she said. "I can drive you Thursday." "I know that too." He waited. He was very good at waiting. She suspected he'd had a lot of practice. "I need to find Jonas Miller," she said. "Someone needs to answer for what he did. I'm not getting on a stage until I understand what actually happened." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "He'll come back eventually," he said. "He always does." "Then I'll wait." Something moved through his eyes, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite alarm, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "All right," he said. "1 week," she said. "That's all I need." He nodded once the way a man nods when he's agreed to something before he's fully thought through what it means. He turned back to the wagon. She picked up the package of supplies the store owner had carried out and handed it up to him without being asked. He looked at it in her hand for a moment. Then he took it. The drive back up the mountain was quieter than the drive down, but the quality of the quiet was different. Less hostile. Less like two strangers, and more like two people who hadn't decided yet what they were to each other, which was at least an honest place to start. He pointed out landmarks without her asking. The ridgeline where the snow came first in autumn. The creek that ran clear all winter unless the cold went down hard. The place in the tree line where he'd found an injured elk calf 2 springs ago and brought it back and fed it until it could go. "You brought a calf inside," she said. "I didn't say inside." "Where then?" "The barn." "Did it live?" "Yes." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about the letter. The careful, formal language. The description of the ranch and the cattle and the good winters. The line near the end that she'd read so many times she could still recite it. "I am a man who has learned to need very little, but I find that what I need most now is someone to share what I have built." Someone had worked hard on that letter. Someone who knew Caleb Mercer well enough to know what he was, what he'd been once, and to imagine him back into it on paper. Someone kind, she said, and meant it. Caleb didn't answer. But this time, when the shadow of a smile crossed his face, he didn't seem to be trying quite as hard to stop it. She found the photograph that evening. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for a second lamp because the light was going and she wanted to read, and she'd seen him take things from the shelf by the window before. When she reached up to feel along the top of the shelf, her hand found the edge of a small frame and she brought it down without thinking. It was a daguerreotype. A woman young and dark-haired, seated in the formal way of photographs with a slight forward lean that suggested she'd been trying to look natural and hadn't quite managed it. But her eyes were warm. Clara could see that even in the flat gray silver of the image. Warm and direct, and full of something that might have been laughter waiting to happen. She was still looking at it when she heard Caleb's step at the door. She turned around. He stopped. She held the photograph out. "I wasn't," she started. "It's all right," he said. His voice was carefully level. "She's beautiful." He crossed the room and took the frame from her hand. He held it the way you hold something that is simultaneously precious and unbearable at arm's length, almost like it might burn if you hold it too close. "How?" Clara asked. She hadn't meant to ask. It came out anyway. "Fever," he said. "It came fast. There wasn't—" He stopped, set the photograph face down on the shelf. "There wasn't time." "Were you—" She stopped herself. "We'd been married 2 years," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the closed-down face of the photograph, the blank back of it. She was 22. Clara's chest ached with the particular kind of hurt that comes from understanding something you can't fix. "You've been alone ever since," she said. "I manage." "That's not the same thing." He looked at her then. Really looked. And she held the look because she thought it was important to, because she thought he needed someone not to flinch from it for once. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." Outside, the wind came up strong through the pines. The fire crackled. Somewhere across the valley, a coyote called once and went quiet. The one-cup cabin held 2 people, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence inside it felt like something other than an ending. It felt just barely like a beginning. She told herself it was practical. That was the word she used lying on top of Caleb's quilt in the dark on the second night, listening to him breathe from the floor by the fire. Practical. She needed to find Jonas Miller. She needed answers before she could move on. She needed at the very minimum to understand what had happened to her before she could figure out what came next. It had nothing to do with the way he'd said Sarah's name. Nothing to do with the photograph. Nothing to do with the fact that when she'd asked him a direct question and he'd answered it honestly, she'd felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been settled in a very long time. Practical. She believed it for approximately 12 hours. The morning of the second day, she woke before him for the first time and lay still for a moment listening. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the first birds were starting up tentative and thin in the cold air. And Caleb Mercer, who had spent 15 years waking alone in this room, was still asleep on his bedroll, with one arm folded under his head and his face for once not guarded. She got up quietly and built the fire back up herself. When he woke to the smell of coffee, he came up from sleep sharply, the way men do when they're not used to being surprised, and he found her at the table with a cup already in her hand and one waiting for him. And he stood there for a moment in the firelight, with his hair pushed sideways from sleep, and just stared at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was awake anyway." He came to the table and picked up the cup and drank without sitting. He was looking out the window at the ridgeline, reading the light the way she'd already noticed him do every morning, calculating what the day would ask of him. "I'm going to check the south fence today," he said. "There's a section that's been giving trouble." "I'll come," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to sit in this cabin all day by myself," she said. "I don't know how you've done it for 15 years. I've been here 48 hours, and the walls are already talking." Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but its close cousin. "It's hard work," he said. "I'm not afraid of hard work." He looked at her hands, which she'd wrapped around the coffee cup, and she knew he was registering the same thing she'd been registering all morning, that her hands were soft in the places that ranch work made calluses. She was a city girl. He knew it. She knew he knew it. "Fine," he said. She hid her surprise by drinking her coffee. The south fence was worse than he'd let on. 3 posts had rotted through at the base, and 2 more were listing badly, and the wire had come loose in 4 places, and Caleb worked on it with the focused efficiency of a man who has done every repair on this place himself for a decade and a half, and long since stopped expecting help. He didn't narrate what he was doing. He didn't explain. He just worked. Clara watched for about 10 minutes and then started handing him things. She didn't ask what he needed. She watched where he was looking and what his hands were reaching for, and she picked it up and held it out at the right moment. And after the 3rd or 4th time, he stopped being surprised by it and just accepted it, the way you accept something that turns out to fit naturally into the rhythm of what you're doing. "Hold this," he said at one point, needing both hands for the wire. She gripped the post. He worked the wire around it, pulling it tight. She could feel the tension in it through her palms. "Tighter," he said. She leaned into it. "Good." It was a small word, 1 syllable. He said it like it meant nothing. It landed in her chest like it meant something. They worked until the sun was directly overhead, and then he stopped and pulled out a piece of hardtack from his coat pocket and broke it in half without looking at her and held out the other half. She took it. They sat on the ground with their backs against the repaired fence and ate in the particular comfortable silence of people who have worked alongside each other and earned the quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been asking me things since you got here." "This is a different kind of question." He waited. "Jonas Miller," she said. "You said he's been your friend a long time." "Since before Sarah died. And he's never—" She chose her words carefully. He's never done anything like this before. Something this drastic. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He put a classified advertisement in a paper once, he said. 3 years ago, looking for someone to share a mountain ranch with a man of steady character. He didn't tell me about it until after. Said he'd gotten 12 responses and was planning to write back. Clara stared at him. What did you do? Told him if he wrote back to a single one of them, I'd never speak to him again. And he believed you? Apparently not completely. She laughed. She hadn't laughed since Chicago. The sound surprised both of them, and she felt Caleb go very still beside her, not in a bad way, more the way you go still when you hear something unexpected that you don't want to frighten off. He loves you, she said, in the infuriating way. Yes, my father was like that, when he bothered. She picked a piece of hardtack apart between her fingers. He was convinced he always knew what was best for me, even when what he thought was best was... She stopped. Anyway. What? Caleb said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching her with that straight, careful attention he gave everything. He thought I should marry a man named Gerald Holt, she said. He had a dry goods store and a house with 3 rooms, and my father thought that was everything a woman could want. But you didn't. Gerald Holt was 53 years old, and he smelled of camphor, and he used to pat my head when I said something he thought was clever, like I was a dog that had learned a trick. She felt the old anger move through her, clean and familiar. I told my father no. We didn't speak much after that. Caleb said nothing, but she could feel him listening in the way he did completely, without preparing what he was going to say next. So when the agency letter came, she said, I had no one to check it with. No one to say, Clara, this doesn't sound right. Clara, you should verify this before you pack everything you own into a bag. She looked out at the valley. I just went. Brave, he said. Foolish, she corrected. Sometimes those are the same thing. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the valley, squinting slightly into the noon light, and she thought again with that complicated feeling she was trying not to examine too closely that he was not what she had expected. Nothing about this was what she had expected, and yet somehow it fit around her in a way that the life she'd come from never had. We should get back, he said, and stood up. She stood up too, brushing dust from her skirt. Caleb, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said, for not sending me away. He looked at her for a moment with that shuttered, careful expression. You needed somewhere to be, he said. That's all. He turned and started back toward the cabin. She followed, and she thought you needed somewhere to be too. She didn't say it, but she thought it. Jonas Miller arrived on the 3rd day like a man who either had no idea what was coming or was pretending very hard. He came up the road just after supper, hollering Caleb's name, before he'd even cleared the tree line his horse at an easy trot. His hat pushed back on his head in the way of a man who considers himself fundamentally welcome everywhere he goes. He was about Caleb's age, shorter, with the kind of wiry energy that never quite settled. He saw Clara first. He pulled the horse up short. The grin that had been spreading across his face underwent a rapid and complicated adjustment, cycling through surprise guilt and a kind of desperate optimism before landing on something that was trying to be innocent and not quite making it. Well, he said. Get off the horse, Jonas, Caleb said. His voice was flat. Jonas got off the horse. Now, Caleb said. And he stepped forward and Jonas stepped back and put both hands up. You are going to explain to me exactly what you did, and you are going to do it right now, with no preamble and no stories. Caleb. Now. Jonas looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb. He took his hat off and held it in front of him with both hands. I wrote the letter, he said. I know you wrote the letter. I wrote the letter and I paid the agency fee and I may have described you as slightly more... He paused. More what? Clara said. Jonas looked at her. He had kind eyes, she noticed. Guilty as sin right now, but genuinely kind. More enthusiastic about the situation than you actually were. He finished. You forged my name, Caleb said. I wrote in your voice. There's a difference. There is no difference, Jonas. Caleb, you have been up on this mountain for 15 years. I know how long I've been here. You've got 200 cattle and 3 books and 1 cup. 1 cup, Caleb. A man doesn't need 1 cup, he needs... Don't, Caleb said, quietly. But the weight in the word was enough to stop Jonas cold. Silence fell over the 3 of them. The horses shifted. Somewhere behind the cabin, one of the cattle lowed once. Clara spoke before she'd decided to. Did you tell the agency anything about me before I was sent? Did you know anything about who they would send? Jonas looked at her carefully. I asked for someone steady, he said. Someone who'd had a hard go and wasn't looking for easy. Someone who'd... He glanced at Caleb and then back at her. Someone who'd know how to be quiet with a person. She stared at him. And who told you about my situation in Chicago? She said. Her voice was very careful now. Because I never contacted your agency. They contacted me. Jonas went very still. They contacted you, he repeated. A letter came to my boarding house. Said a rancher in Utah had specifically requested a woman of my background and circumstances. Said my name had been given by a reference. She stepped forward. What reference, Jonas? Who gave them my name? Jonas opened his mouth and closed it again. And for the first time, the guilty calculation left his face entirely, and what replaced it was something much more concerning. Genuine confusion. I didn't give them a name, he said slowly. I paid the fee, and I described what I was looking for, and I left it to them to find someone suitable. His eyes sharpened. They told you a specific name had requested you. In writing, Clara said. I have the letter. Jonas looked at Caleb. Caleb was very still. Then someone else knew you were coming, Jonas said. The words fell into the room and sat there. What do you mean? Clara said. I mean, I wrote a letter and paid a fee, Jonas said slowly. I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you were coming from. Someone else gave the agency your name specifically. Someone else made sure it was you who got on that train. He looked at Caleb. Who knows about your land, Caleb? Who would want to? Don't, Caleb said again. But this time it wasn't quiet. This time it had an edge. Jonas fell silent. Clara looked between them. Someone tell me what's happening, she said. Neither of them spoke. Now, she said. She had her father's firmness in her voice, the one she'd hated in him and inherited from him regardless. Caleb turned away, walked to the far side of the room, stood there with his back to both of them for a long moment. There's a man named William Garrett, he said, who has been trying to buy this land for 3 years. Clara waited. He's offered twice what it's worth, Caleb said. Each time I've said no. Each time he's found another way to apply pressure. He turned back. His jaw was hard. He knows that I'm alone up here. He knows I have no family. He knows the only witness to anything on this property is me. You think he arranged for me to come here? Clara said. I think it's possible. Why, what does sending a mail-order bride accomplish? The silence stretched. Jonas was looking at the floor. Garrett has friends in the territorial government, Caleb said. Friends who can make things complicated. If there were questions about my conduct, my character. He stopped. Clara understood. A woman alone on a mountain with a man she wasn't married to. Accusations. False ones, maybe. But in 1883 in Utah Territory, accusations didn't need to be proven to be damaging. He wanted to give himself a weapon, she said. Caleb said nothing, which was its own answer. Then, Jonas is just... She looked at Jonas. A fool, Jonas said quietly. He looked genuinely stricken. I didn't know. Clara, I swear to you, I didn't know anyone else was involved. I thought I was doing something kind. He pressed his hat against his chest. I am so sorry. She believed him. She didn't particularly want to, but she believed him. "Does Garrett know I'm here?" she asked. "He'll know by now," Caleb said. "He has people in town who tell him things." "Then he's already watching." "He's always watching." She sat down. Not because she was weak, she was very deliberately not weak right now, but because she needed to think, and she thought better when her body was still. "All right," she said. Both men looked at her. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. What she proposed was simple, and Caleb fought it for 20 minutes before she wore him down. She would stay. Not temporarily. Not for a week while they sorted out the Jonas situation. She would stay as his housekeeper publicly with Jonas as witness in an arrangement that was documented and legitimate, and gave Garrett exactly nothing to use against either of them. "You came here as a bride," Caleb said. "Everyone in town already knows that. Then we tell the truth. The letter was a mistake. But I needed work, and you needed help, and we've come to an arrangement. It's not complicated. People will talk. People will talk regardless. The question is whether the story they're telling is mine or William Garrett's." He looked at her for a long time. "You don't have to do this," he said. "This isn't your problem. Garrett, the land, none of this is what you signed up for." "I didn't sign up for any of this," she said. "But I'm here." She met his eyes steadily. "And I'm not leaving because someone wants me to leave." Something shifted in his face. Something she hadn't seen before. Not the shadow of a smile, not the closed-down, careful look, but something rawer and more honest than either of those. Something that looked briefly and almost painfully like gratitude. "1 month," he said. "1 month," she agreed. Jonas, who had been standing by the door throughout this entire exchange, let out a long breath. "I'm sorry," he said again to both of them. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," Clara told him. "Not much, but something." Jonas had the grace to look ashamed of himself. The thing about staying, Clara discovered, was that it changed the quality of the time. When she'd been waiting to leave, each day had been a transaction. She was taking something from Caleb's space and his silence and his carefully maintained solitude, and giving nothing permanent in return. But once the decision was made, once 1 month was established, as the frame of it, the days became something else. They had weight. They had consequence. She stopped being a stranger passing through and started being someone who was actually here. And being actually here meant seeing things she wouldn't have seen otherwise. She saw the way he worked himself past exhaustion every single day without complaint, pushing until the light gave out, and sometimes past it as if rest were a luxury he hadn't earned and wasn't going to allow himself. She saw the way he ate standing up quickly without attention, the way a man eats when eating is fuel rather than pleasure. She saw the 3 books on the shelf, the Bible and the Surveyor's Manual, and the Tennyson, and she noticed that the Tennyson was the most worn of the 3, its spine cracked and its pages soft. She didn't ask about it, not yet. What she did instead was cook, not because she was auditioning for anything. Not because she was trying to demonstrate value. She cooked because she was hungry, and because she was good at it, and because standing over a fire doing something with her hands was better than sitting with nothing to do and too much to think about. The first evening she made a proper supper, salt pork and beans and cornbread. Nothing elaborate, but hot and full and seasoned. Caleb came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway with the smell of it hitting him. He didn't say anything, but he washed his hands before he sat down. He hadn't done that the first 2 nights. It was a small thing. But she noticed. They ate mostly in silence, and at the end of it, he pushed back from the table and said, "That was good," in the same flat tone he used for everything, and she said, "Thank you," in the same brisk tone she used for everything, and neither of them acknowledged that the meal had been different from the meals before it in any way that mattered. But it had been. They both knew it. Ooh, on the 6th day, she found the grave. She wasn't looking for it. She'd gone out past the barn to check on a chicken that had been behaving strangely. She'd appointed herself informal keeper of the 4 chickens. Caleb kept more out of habit than necessity, and she walked around the back of the stone outcropping behind the barn, and there it was. A simple marker. Wood, not stone, but carefully made the letters carved by someone who'd taken time with each one. Sarah Ann Mercer, 1849 to 1871. Beloved. Just the one word after the dates. Beloved. She stood there for a long time. She heard him come up behind her, quiet as he always was, and she didn't turn around. I didn't mean to find it, she said. I know. She was 22. Yes, she turned then. He was closer than she'd realized, and the look on his face was not what she'd expected. Not closed down. Not guarded. It was open in a way his face almost never was, like a door left ajar. You keep it, she said. The ground around the marker was clear. The weeds pulled, the wood maintained. You take care of it. Yes. Every day. Every time I come past. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved between them. She would have wanted you to have a cup for company, Clara said. It came out before she'd thought about it, and the moment it was out, she wasn't sure how he'd take it, if she'd gone too far, if she'd broken something fragile. But he looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen happen there before. He smiled. Not the shadow of one, not the memory. The real thing, brief and unguarded and gone almost as quickly as it came, but real. Probably, he said. She turned back to the marker. She felt the shape of the moment without naming it, without pressing it into something it wasn't yet. I'll give her some of the cornbread next time, she said, since she's responsible for the arrangement. He made a sound, low, brief. She thought it might have been a laugh. She started back toward the cabin, and she did not look back because she didn't need to. She could feel him following, and the feeling was not complicated at all. It was, in fact, the simplest feeling she'd had in years. Like she was walking towards something rather than away from it. Like maybe for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The second cup appeared on a Tuesday. Clara didn't comment on it. She came in from the henhouse with eggs in her apron and found 2 cups on the table instead of 1, and she set the eggs down carefully and poured coffee into both of them and said nothing at all. Neither did Caleb. He came in from the barn, washed his hands, sat down, picked up his cup and drank. But she saw the way he watched her out of the corner of his eye to see if she'd noticed. She had noticed. She noticed everything. That was the thing about living in a space this compressed with a person, this guarded. The small things became enormous. A second cup. A held door. The way he'd started coming in for supper at the same time every evening, instead of whenever the work stopped, which told her he was timing himself against something, now which told her something she wasn't ready to name. The month was not quite 2 weeks old, and already the shape of it had changed. She'd stopped thinking about Denver. She hadn't stopped thinking about William Garrett. It was Jonas who brought the first real piece of news riding up the mountain on a Thursday afternoon with his hat down against a cold wind and an expression that said the news wasn't good. He'd been making himself useful since the confession. She could give him that. He'd taken it upon himself to ask careful questions in town, to listen in the places where men talked when they thought nobody important was listening. He dismounted and came inside and accepted the coffee Clara pressed on him and sat down across from Caleb with his hands wrapped around the cup. Garrett's been talking, he said. Caleb didn't move. About what? About Clara. Jonas glanced at her. About the situation. The way he's telling it, she came up here under false pretenses, and he's implying you're keeping her here against her will. The silence was absolute. That's a lie, Clara said. I know that. You know that. Jonas looked at Caleb. But he's telling it to Judge Harlan, who owes him 2 favors and a considerable sum of money. What does he want? Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. The kind of quiet that was worse than loud. He wants the land same as always, but now he's found a way to make it a legal matter. If there are questions about your conduct, if someone were to file a complaint... Jonas stopped. He could have a marshal up here inside 2 weeks. Clara set her cup down. Her hands were steady. Inside, something cold had started moving through her chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular fury of someone who has been used as a tool without their knowledge. "He knew," she said, "before I ever arrived. He knew Jonas had written that letter, and he saw an opportunity." "That's what I think," Jonas said miserably. "Which means someone at the agency told him," Caleb said. "Or he has someone at the agency," Clara said. "Someone who flagged Jonas's inquiry and brought it to Garrett and let him shape it." She looked at Jonas. "The letter I received, the one that said my name had been specifically requested, that wasn't from your letter, was it? Someone rewrote the contact to make sure it was me who came." Jonas looked sick. "Clara, Why me?" she said, not to Jonas, to the room, to the logic of it. "Why specifically me? Garrett doesn't know me. I'm nobody from Chicago. Why would he—" She stopped. The cold thing in her chest went colder. "What?" Caleb said. He was watching her face. "My employer," she said slowly. "In Chicago. The man who accused me." She pressed her fingers against the table. "His name was Douglas Fenn. He owned a textile operation, and he was looking for a reason to dismiss me without paying the wages he owed, because I had been asking questions about the accounts." The room was very quiet. "What kind of questions?" Caleb said. "The kind that accountants ask when numbers don't add up," she said. "I wasn't a seamstress. I told you I was because it was easier. I was a bookkeeper. I kept accounts for Fenn's operation for 3 years. She looked up. "And about 8 months ago I found something that didn't make sense. Money moving in ways it shouldn't. A second set of figures that didn't match the first." Jonas put his cup down very carefully. "I went to Fenn directly," she said. "I told him what I'd found, and I asked for an explanation. 2 days later, he accused me of stealing from the company accounts. He had witnesses, men who worked for him, who would say whatever he needed them to say." She felt the old anger again, clean and white-hot. "I had to leave. If I'd stayed to fight it, I would have gone to jail for something he did." "And someone helped you find the agency letter," Caleb said. "A woman at my boarding house," Clara said. "She said she'd seen a letter come for me left under the door. She didn't know who left it." She looked at him. "I thought it was Providence. I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought something had finally gone right." "Fenn and Garrett," Jonas said. "You think they know each other. I think it's possible. Men like that find each other." She stood up from the table because she needed to move. "I think Douglas Fenn wanted me out of Chicago and as far away as possible, and William Garrett wanted a complication on this mountain, and somewhere between the two of them, they found a way to use Jonas's letter to accomplish both things." Caleb stood up too. He crossed to the window, stood there with his back to the room, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was working through it, the way a man works through something when he spent 15 years solving every problem alone and is only now beginning to understand that this one might be too large for that. "I won't let him use you," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "He already has," she said. "The question is, what we do about it." He turned, and his eyes were hard, not cold, but hard, the way iron is hard, the way something gets when it's been through enough heat. "You said you kept the letters," he said. "Everything the agency sent." "In my carpet bag, yes. And you were keeping accounts. You said you found figures that didn't add up. I memorized them," she said. "Before I left. I wrote them down and I've carried them since." She paused. "I didn't know why I did it at the time. I just knew that someday I might need to prove something." Jonas was looking between them with an expression of someone watching a chess game between two people considerably better at chess than he was. "Where would we need to go to prove any of this?" Caleb said. "That depends on what we're trying to prove," Clara said. "The agency fraud that would need someone inside the agency or documentation of how they were paid and by whom." She met his eyes. "But the Chicago accounts, those could go to a federal circuit judge if we could get the documentation to the right person." "That takes time," Jonas said. "Yes," she agreed. "It takes time." She looked at Caleb. "Which is why I can't leave." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for more time," she said quickly. "I'm not trying to extend the arrangement. I'm saying that if I get on that stage and go to Denver, I am exactly what Garrett needs me to be, a woman who ran, which makes me look guilty, which makes you look worse." She held his gaze. "I have to stay, and I have to be visible, and I have to be someone he cannot make disappear." The silence held for a beat. "Stay," Caleb said. "Simple as that." "We need to find someone we can trust," she said. "Someone who isn't connected to Garrett or Fenn or the agency." Jonas sat up straighter. "I might know someone." Both of them looked at him. "Sister Mary Catherine," he said. "She runs the mission school outside town. She's been there 20 years. She knows everybody, and she owes favors to nobody, and she is approximately the most frightening person I have ever met." He paused. "She was also friends with the previous agency operator, before Garrett's people bought out the agency 3 years ago." Clara and Caleb looked at each other. 3 years ago, Caleb said. 3 years ago, Clara repeated. "The same year he started trying to buy this land." The pieces were assembling themselves into a shape that was becoming very clear and very ugly. "Jonas," Caleb said, "can you get a message to Sister Mary Catherine without going through town?" "I can go myself, tonight if you need." "Tonight?" Caleb said. After Jonas left, the cabin felt charged, like the air before lightning when everything is still but nothing is settled. Clara got out the letters from her carpet bag and spread them on the table. Caleb sat across from her, and they went through them methodically, her explaining each one, him asking questions that were precise and practical, not rushing her, not pushing, just following the logic of it with the same careful attention he gave to everything. It was, she realized, the longest conversation they had ever had. "This line here," he said, pointing to a sentence in the agency letter. "They say your reference was a Mrs. H. Calloway. Do you know that name?" "No." "There's a Harold Calloway who does land surveys for the territorial office," he said. "He's done work near my north boundary before." Clara looked at him. "Another connection," she said. "It might be nothing. It might be everything." She pulled the paper closer. "Caleb, how much is this land actually worth? Not what Garrett has offered." He was quiet for a moment. "To me or to him?" "To him. Why does he want it specifically?" He leaned back. The fire crackled. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was deciding how much to say. "There's water on this land," he said. "2 springs. Both of them run year-round, even in drought years. The southern quarter alone could supply 3 times what I run on it." He paused. "There's talk of a rail line coming through the valley in the next 5 years. Whoever controls the water rights in this territory, when the rail comes, will control the cattle operations for 100 miles. Clara stared at him. "You knew this," she said. "You've known all along what this land is worth." "Yes. And you're still here, alone, holding it." "It's my land," he said. The simplicity of it was absolute. "Sarah and I built this together. What's here because of that stays here because of that." She looked at him for a long moment. At the straight line of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes, the unmovable quality of him that she had initially read as stubbornness, and was only now understanding, was something else entirely. Something closer to faithfulness. To a kind of love that didn't end just because the person it was meant for was gone. "He's never going to stop," she said quietly. "No." "Then we have to end it," she said. "Not just defend against him. End it." He looked at her across the table, across the spread letters, across all of it. "I've been thinking the same thing for 3 years," he said. "I didn't have enough to move against him." "You do now," she said. "You have me." The words were out before she'd weighed them, and she felt the weight of them the moment they landed. How they could be taken, how they probably sounded, how they were truer than she'd intended. Caleb didn't look away. "Yes," he said. "I do." Sister Mary Catherine arrived 2 days later. She came alone, which surprised Clara. She came on a gray mule, which did not surprise her once she saw the woman's small spare somewhere north of 60, with eyes that had the permanent, slightly amused quality of someone who has seen enough of human foolishness to stop being shocked by any of it. She looked at Clara for a long time before she spoke. "You're the girl from Chicago," she said. "I am," Clara said. "You don't look ruined." "I'm not ruined." "Good." Sister Mary Catherine handed her mule's reins to Jonas, who happened to be standing nearby, and accepted them with the expression of a man who has learned not to argue with nuns. "Let's go inside. I've been carrying something for 3 years that I think belongs in this conversation." Caleb held the door. She walked in and sat at the table without being invited, and folded her hands, and looked around the cabin with the appraising eye of someone taking inventory. "2 cups," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Good," she said again. She reached into the front of her habit, her black habit, her practical, road-worn habit, and produced a small envelope sealed and yellowed slightly at the edges. She set it on the table between them. 3 years ago, she said, the woman who ran the marriage agency in this territory came to me before she sold her business. She was frightened. She said a man had bought the agency through a third party, and she didn't like the look of it, didn't trust his intentions. She gave me this to hold. Clara and Caleb looked at the envelope. "She told me I would know when the right time was to give it to someone," Sister Mary Catherine said. "I believe this is the right time." Caleb picked it up. He looked at Clara. She nodded. He opened it. Inside was a single folded paper, a letter handwritten between 2 names that meant a great deal in the context of everything they'd been piecing together. A letter from William Garrett to Douglas Fenn, dated 18 months ago, outlining a plan, specific, detailed, and specific in the way that only people who never expect to be caught are specific. Clara read it over Caleb's shoulder. Her hand, without her thinking about it, came to rest on the back of his chair. The letter described in straightforward business language an arrangement between Garrett and Fenn. Fenn would force a certain bookkeeper out of Chicago by means of a false accusation. Garrett's agent at the marriage agency would ensure that same bookkeeper received a very specific invitation. The bookkeeper would arrive at the Mercer Ranch in Utah under circumstances that would appear to the right authorities improper. Then Garrett would file a complaint. The marshal would come. Mercer, whose isolation and eccentricity were well documented, would be hard-pressed to defend himself. And a man facing a marshal's inquiry, with no family and no allies, might finally be amenable to a reasonable offer for his land. There was her name, Clara Whitfield, written in Garrett's hand. She had been chosen, selected, specifically engineered into this situation before she'd ever set foot on a train. "He knew my name before I knew his," she said. Her voice was absolutely steady. Inside something was shaking, not with fear, not anymore, but with the particular cold rage of someone who sees clearly for the first time the full shape of what was done to them. "Yes," Sister Mary Catherine said. "He used Jonas's letter as cover," Caleb said. He was reading the letter again slowly. "Made it look like sentiment, an old friend meddling, something harmless, while the real mechanism was already in place. He planned it for months," Clara said. "Maybe longer." She straightened up, took one breath. "He must have known about the water rights rumor, about the rail line. Everyone in the territorial government knows," Sister Mary Catherine said. "It's not a rumor anymore. The survey was completed last month." She looked at Caleb. "Your land sits directly on the proposed route, not near it, on it." Jonas, who had come in somewhere during all of this, said, "Lord have mercy," in a quiet voice from the doorway. Nobody disagreed with the sentiment. Caleb set the letter down. He put both hands flat on the table and was still for a moment in the way he went still when he was deciding something. Then he looked at Clara. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was such a simple question, such a direct, unadorned question. Not what do we do next, or how do we proceed, or any of the practical things that needed addressing. Just, are you all right? She thought about the boarding house in Chicago, the cold water flat and the machine oil smell, and the letter that had seemed like Providence and had turned out to be a trap. She thought about the train ride with her carpet bag on her knees, and the letter folded and refolded in her pocket, and the hope she'd let herself feel, which she'd known even then was dangerous. She thought about the second cup on the table. "I'm angry," she said. "But yes, I'm all right." He held her gaze for one moment longer than was necessary. Then he turned to Sister Mary Catherine. "Can this letter be used in court in front of a judge? Will it hold?" "It will hold," she said. "I've already spoken to a circuit judge who is not in Garrett's pocket. He's been looking for cause to examine Garrett's business arrangements for 2 years." She folded her hands. "What he needs is a witness who will stand up and testify. Someone who can speak to both the Chicago situation and the land arrangement." She looked at Clara. "Someone who kept the accounts." Everyone in the room turned to look at Clara. She thought about what it meant. Standing up in a courtroom, saying what she knew to be true in front of men who would try to make her look unstable, dishonest, foolish for being deceived. She knew how that went. She'd seen it go that way for other women. She also thought about what happened if she didn't. Caleb losing his land, Garrett winning, Douglas Fenn continuing to do what he'd done to her to someone else. She picked up the letter from the table and looked at her name written in a stranger's handwriting, used without her knowledge as a piece in a game she hadn't known she was playing. She set it down. "When does the circuit judge come through?" she asked. "Sister Mary." Catherine's expression shifted just barely. Just enough. The permanent slight amusement went a little warmer. 3 weeks, she said. "Then we have 3 weeks to prepare," Clara said. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with the open expression, the one she'd first seen at the grave. The door left ajar look, the one that was so much more than his careful everyday face. "Together," she said. Not asking, stating. "Together," he said, and across the table, across all the letters, and all the evidence, and all the elaborate cruelty of men who thought they could move people around like pieces on a board. She felt it shift again. The thing between them that had been building in the silence day by day, and cup by cup, and word by careful word. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It moved through the room the way certainty moves quietly, and with the full weight of something that has been true for longer than either person has been willing to say. Sister Mary Catherine looked at the two of them and said nothing. She just picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and held it out to Jonas with the serene authority of a woman who expects to be taken care of. Jonas, to his credit, refilled it without being asked twice. 3 weeks felt like both too much time and not nearly enough. Too much because Garrett knew they were preparing. He wasn't a patient man, that much was clear from the way his pressure had been building, the way every move he'd made had been designed to force a quick resolution before anyone could organize against him. And a man like that, watching his plan unravel from a distance, was a man who might decide to stop waiting for legal mechanisms and try something faster. Not nearly enough, because what Clara was preparing to do in that courtroom required not just documentation, but testimony. Personal, detailed, unshakable testimony. The kind that men like Douglas Fenn and William Garrett spent considerable money trying to discredit. She knew how they would come at her. She'd seen it done to other women. They would question her character before they questioned her facts. They would ask about her living situation, about a woman alone on a mountain with a man she wasn't married to, and they would let the implication do the work that the evidence couldn't. She knew all of this. What she hadn't counted on was how much harder it was to prepare for it with Caleb watching. Not watching in the intrusive way. He wasn't that kind of man, but he was present in the way he'd become present over these 3 weeks, aware of her. In the particular way you become aware of someone when they have become the central fact of your daily life without either of you quite deciding that was what was happening. She'd catch him looking at her across the room sometimes, and he wouldn't look away quickly the way people do when they're embarrassed to be caught. He'd just hold it for a moment, and then go back to whatever he was doing, as if looking at her were simply something that was allowed now. Something that had been quietly authorized somewhere along the way without a formal announcement. It made her feel things she didn't have good language for. So she worked. She organized the documents. She wrote out the account figures from memory in careful columns, checked them 3 times, and matched them against what she'd written down before she left Chicago. She wrote a statement, rewrote it, tore it up, and wrote it again. Caleb brought her coffee every time her cup ran dry. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. On the 8th day before the hearing, Jonas came up the mountain at a dead gallop. Clara heard the horse before she saw it, and was already at the door by the time Jonas came through the tree line, his hat gone, his face tight. "Garrett filed," he said, pulling up hard. "He didn't wait. He went to Judge Harlan this morning and filed a formal complaint. Improper conduct, immoral cohabitation, all of it." He was breathing hard. "Harlan issued a summons. Marshals coming up the mountain tomorrow morning." Clara felt the cold clarity that comes when the thing you've been bracing for finally arrives. "How many men?" she asked. "The marshal and 2 deputies, and Garrett's lawyer." "Garrett himself. Not yet. He's letting Harlan do the work first." Caleb came out of the barn. He'd heard the horse. He looked at Jonas's face and didn't need to be told anything. He'd read the situation from 10 yards away. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Jonas confirmed. Caleb looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "Then we're ready today," she said. "We're not," Jonas started. "We're ready," she said again. Firm. Final. She went back inside and sat down, and for exactly 30 seconds she let herself feel it. The fear, the anger, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting the same battle under different names for the better part of a year. She let herself feel all of it, and then she set it down. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Caleb came in after Jonas left and sat across from her and watched her write for a while without speaking. "Tell me what to do," he said finally. She looked up. The firelight was behind him, and his face was in half shadow, and he looked like what he was, a man who had spent 15 years being unmovable, and was now for the first time in a very long time asking someone else for direction. "When the marshal comes," she said, "you don't argue, you don't explain, you answer what he asks and nothing more." "And you?" "I'm a housekeeper in a documented arrangement witnessed by Jonas and Sister Mary Catherine. I have letters. I have a contract." She'd drawn up a simple housekeeper's agreement 3 weeks ago on Sister Mary Catherine's advice. "What I am not is what Garrett is saying I am, and the documentation proves it. Harlan is Garrett's man. Harlan is a territorial judge, with a circuit judge coming in 3 weeks who outranks him, and is already aware of this situation," she said. "Harlan is also a man who probably doesn't know the full shape of what Garrett has been doing. Men like Harlan don't ask questions because asking questions is dangerous, but they also don't like being exposed." She set her pen down. "When he sees what we have, he'll back away. Garrett is useful to him. Being publicly connected to land fraud and a conspiracy against a private citizen is not." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You understand these men very well." "I had a very thorough education," she said. All of it unpleasant. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, something older than that. The protective kind, the kind that comes from caring about someone enough to be angry on their behalf about things that happened before you knew them. "If I'd known what they did to you," he started. "You didn't know me," she said, gently. "You do now." He held her eyes for a beat that was long enough to mean something. "Yes," he said. "I do." She picked up her pen. Her hand was absolutely steady. She kept writing. The marshal arrived at 9 in the morning, and he was younger than she'd expected, which meant he was probably competent, which meant this was going to be more careful work than simply outlasting someone who'd seen everything before and stopped paying attention. His name was Carver. He had deputies on either side of him, and a lawyer behind him, who had the particular overfed look of men retained by wealthy clients, and he came through the door of the cabin and looked around with professional attention and landed on Clara and stayed there. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Marshal," she said. You understand why I'm here." "I understand why you were told to be here," she said, which is a different thing. Carver studied her. He wasn't unfriendly, she decided. He was cautious the way honest men get in situations where the honest path isn't immediately clear. "I have a complaint filed by William Garrett," she said. "Yes, I know. I've been expecting it." She reached across the table and produced the housekeeper's contract signed and witnessed. "This is the arrangement under which I am employed here. It was drawn up in the second week of my arrival, witnessed by Jonas Miller and Sister Mary Catherine of the Mission School, and is entirely consistent with territorial labor law." She set it in front of him. "Would you like to see the documentation from the marriage agency explaining how I came to be in Utah in the first place? Because that's interesting reading." Carver picked up the contract. His lawyer leaned over to look at it, and his expression changed barely but noticeably. "Miss Whitfield," Carver said carefully, The complaint alleges what William Garrett needs it to allege," she said. "And I have evidence that William Garrett has been planning this allegation for at least 18 months, in coordination with a man in Chicago named Douglas Fenn, for the specific purpose of pressuring Mr. Mercer into selling land that Garrett wants because a railway survey has confirmed it sits on the proposed route." She kept her voice level, factual, unhurried. "I have that evidence in writing. In Garrett's own hand. Obtained by a witness who has been holding it for 3 years and is prepared to present it before a circuit judge in 3 weeks." Silence. Carver set the contract down very slowly. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a documented one," she said. "Marshal, I don't think you came here to do Garrett's dirty work. I think you came here because you were given a complaint and you're doing your job. So let me make your job easier." She slid the sheaf of documents across the table. "Take these, read them, and then ask yourself whether the man who filed that complaint today is someone you want to be publicly standing beside in 3 weeks." Carver looked at the documents. He looked at Caleb, who had been standing by the wall this entire time, in complete silence, watching. He looked at his own lawyer, who had stopped looking at the contract, and was now looking at Clara with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone revising their assessment of a situation rapidly. "I'll need to review these," Carver said. "Of course," she said. "Take them with you. I have copies." She did not have copies. She had memorized every word. Carver picked up the documents. He held them carefully, the way you hold something when you're not yet sure if it's a gift or a grenade. "Mr. Mercer," he said, looking at Caleb. "Marshal," Caleb said. "Are you prepared to appear before judge?" "Before the circuit judge," Clara said. "Not Judge Harlan. Given that Harlan accepted the complaint filed by a man who stands to benefit directly from this land being forcibly transferred, we believe the circuit court is the appropriate venue." Carver blinked. He looked at her one more time. Something shifted in his expression, the professional neutrality cracking just slightly at the edges, to let through something that might, in different circumstances, have been admiration. "I'll be in touch," he said. "We'll be here," she said. The moment the marshal and his deputies rode out of sight, Jonas let out a sound like a man who has been holding his breath underwater and finally surfaced. "Lord above," he said. "Clara Whitfield, where have you been all my life?" "Chicago," she said. "Keeping accounts." Caleb hadn't moved from the wall. He was looking at her with that open expression, the one that had become familiar, now the one that still did something complicated to her pulse every time it appeared. "You were magnificent," he said, quietly, like it was just a fact. "I was terrified," she said, equally quiet. "I know," he said. "That's what made it magnificent." She felt the warmth of it move through her before she could stop it, and she looked away toward the window, because there were things she wasn't ready to say in daylight with Jonas standing 3 feet away. "He'll go back to Garrett," she said. "Carver will tell him what I said, and Garrett will know we have the letter." "Yes," Caleb said. "Which means he'll move faster now. He won't wait for the circuit court." "What does that mean?" Jonas said. "What does faster look like?" Caleb pushed off from the wall. "It means someone needs to get to Sister Mary Catherine and make sure she and that letter are somewhere safe." "I'll go," Jonas said immediately. He was already reaching for his hat. "Tonight," Caleb said. "Before morning." Jonas nodded and went for his horse without another word. That left the two of them alone in the cabin, and the quiet that came down after Jonas left was different from all the other quiets. Charged in a way that the space hadn't been charged before, as if the events of the last hour had stripped something away and left the room more honest. Clara sat down. She hadn't eaten since early morning. She hadn't noticed until now. Caleb went to the fire and came back with bread and salt meat and set it in front of her without asking. She ate. He sat across from her and watched her eat and didn't make any bones about the watching. "Say what you're thinking," she said without looking up. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I have lived on this land for 15 years and fought for it in every practical way I know how. And in 3 weeks you did more to defend it than I've done in 3 years. She looked up then. "You couldn't have done what I did," she said, "because what I did required knowing things you don't know and being what I am rather than what you are." "And what are you?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. "Someone who was very badly hurt," she said, "and learned everything she could from it." He was quiet for a moment. "So was I," he said. "I know. I stopped learning," he said. "For a long time. I stopped taking anything in. I kept the land. I kept the cattle. I kept everything exactly as it was." He looked at his hands. "I thought I was being faithful." "You were," she said. "I was hiding," he said. "There's a difference." She set down the bread. She looked at him across the table, across the 2 cups, across everything that had accumulated between them over a month of mornings, and shared work and careful silence. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm saying. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a man who speaks easily. You know that. I know that. So when I say something, it means I've been carrying it a long time." Her heart was doing something she couldn't entirely control. "Say it then," she said. He looked at her directly. No deflection, no careful management of his expression. Just his face as it actually was, with 15 years of grief and solitude, and the first real feeling of something else threaded through all of it. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not after the trial. Not after Garrett is dealt with. Not I don't want you to leave." He stopped. "That's all. That's all I know how to say right now." Clara was very still. She thought about Denver, about $11 and a stagecoach and starting over. She thought about the cold water flat and the machine oil smell and the life that had been closing around her before the letter came, and how the letter had been a trap but had led her here, and how here was the only place in years where she'd woken up in the morning and felt like herself. "Then I won't leave," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that," he said. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know," he said. "More negotiation." "I've had enough negotiation to last a lifetime," she said. "When something is clear, I prefer to say so." The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile. The real one underneath it, the one she'd now seen twice and intended to see many more times. "Clara," he said. "Caleb," she said. "I haven't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "It's been a long time since I know," she said. "I'm not going to be easy," he said. "I don't know how to do this anymore. Any of it. I'll get things wrong." "So will I," she said. "We'll get things wrong together. That's generally how it works." He looked at her for a long moment, and the look held everything that wasn't being said, all the tenderness and uncertainty, and raw, cautious hope of a man who has been shut down so long he'd forgotten the feeling of opening. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his hand on top of hers, warm and rough from years of work pressing down gently, the way you press on something to make sure it's real. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time, while the fire burned and the mountain held its long silence outside, and the two cups sat side by side on the table like they had always been exactly where they belonged. She thought this is what it feels like. Not the lightning version that the novels described. Not the sweep-you-off-your-feet version. Not any of the versions she'd half believed in, back when she still had room for that kind of believing. This version. Quiet and hard-won, and absolutely certain. The kind that grows out of shared work and shared danger, and two people who have each survived things and come through the other side of them, and found against all reasonable expectation that they still have something left to give. She didn't say any of that. She just held his hand and let the quiet be what it was, which was finally after everything not empty at all. Garrett's next move came 2 days later, and it was worse than they'd anticipated. Not a legal complaint this time. Not a marshal with deputies. Something cruder, faster, and designed to bypass all the careful preparation they'd done. A man came to the cabin just after dark. Not Garrett. Garrett never came himself, but a man who had the look of someone hired for specific purposes, with a message folded in his coat pocket, and a manner that said he was used to delivering messages that people didn't want to receive. Clara answered the door because Caleb was in the barn. The man looked at her with flat professional disinterest. "Message for Mercer," he said. "I'll take it," she said. He handed it over without argument and left without another word. She had it open before Caleb came back inside. The message was short. 3 sentences. Garrett's handwriting, she recognized it from the letter Sister Mary Catherine had given them. The girl has outstanding warrants in Cook County, Illinois. Fraud. The relevant authorities have been notified of her current location. She should present herself voluntarily, or the matter will be handled otherwise. Clara read it twice. Then she set it on the table, and sat down and pressed both hands flat on the wood and breathed. She heard Caleb's step at the door, heard him stop when he saw her face. "What is it?" he said. She slid the paper across the table. He read it. She watched his face go through several things rapidly. First the close reading stillness, then the understanding, then something hard and cold that settled over his features like iron cooling in a mold. He set the paper down. "Is it true?" he asked, not accusatory, just direct. "The warrant may be real," she said. "Fenn had the means to file one. Whether there's anything behind it other than his word and his paid witnesses is another matter." She met his eyes. "But a warrant is a warrant. If Garrett has notified Cook County authorities of my location, they can come for me regardless of what the circuit judge finds. How long do we have? If he sent word today, a week, maybe less." Caleb was quiet for the long moment. "Sister Mary Catherine," he said. "She can't help with this. This is a different jurisdiction." "No," he said, "but she knows people I don't. And she's been doing God's work in this territory for 20 years, which means she's done it alongside every kind of person, including the kind who know how warrants get filed and how they get challenged." He was already reaching for his coat. "I'm going to town tonight." "Caleb, I'm going to town tonight," he said again, and the way he said it left no room for discussion. He turned at the door and looked at her. "Lock the door." "I know how to lock a door." "I know you do." A pause. "I know exactly what you know how to do." Something moved in his face, briefly fierce and very clear. "That's why I'm going to town. Because what Fenn did to you in Chicago was wrong, and I am not going to let it follow you here. Not to my land. Not into this house." She held his gaze. "Come back," she said. "I'll be back before morning," he said. He went. She locked the door. She sat back down at the table and looked at the message from Garrett, and felt underneath the fear and the anger something that surprised her with its steadiness. Something that said, "You are not alone in this. Not anymore." She picked up her pen. She started writing again. Whatever was coming next, she was going to be ready. Caleb came back before dawn. Clara heard his horse on the road and was at the door before he knocked because she hadn't slept and hadn't pretended to. She'd sat at the table all night with her pen and her documents and the low fire, and the particular kind of alertness that isn't quite fear, but lives right next to it. He came in with cold air on his coat and something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the open look, not the guarded look, but something that was both at once like a man who has just done something that cost him and doesn't regret it. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's hot." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't drink immediately. "Sister Mary Catherine has a contact in Cook County," he said. "A priest. He's worked with the courts there for 30 years. He paused. "He knows Douglas Fenn, not personally, professionally. He's heard the name in connection with labor complaints before. Other workers, other accusations. Clara, you're not the first person Fenn has done this to." She was very still. "There are others," she said. "At least 3 women from what Father Donahue knows. All of them bookkeepers or clerks. All of them let go under accusations of fraud. All of them left Chicago rather than fight it." He looked at her. "None of them had the account figures memorized. None of them knew they'd need them," she said. "No." He set the cup down. "Father Donahue is going to make contact with the Cook County Circuit Court. He believes the warrant against you can be challenged on the basis of a pattern of false accusations if we can get the documentation in front of the right clerk before Garrett's people move." He met her eyes. "We have maybe 4 days. Then we start this morning," she said. "I thought you'd say that. Did you sleep at all?" "No." She stood up and went to the fire. She put more coffee on, more water, started cutting the bread because they both needed to eat and neither of them was going to remember to do it otherwise. She worked and he watched, and after a moment, he stood up and came to stand beside her and started cutting without being asked, just taking the knife from the board and doing it the same way she handed him fence wire because it was needed and it was in front of him and there was no reason to stand still when something needed doing. Their hands almost touched twice. Neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved away. The next 4 days ran together in a single sustained state of controlled urgency. Jonas rode between the mountain and the mission school carrying documents. Sister Mary Catherine wrote letters in her small, precise hand and dispatched them through channels that Clara didn't fully understand but had stopped questioning. Father Donahue, whom Clara never met, but who became a central figure in all of their lives during those 4 days, moved through Cook County with the particular effectiveness of a man who has spent 30 years learning which doors open for a priest that stay shut for everyone else. On the evening of the 3rd day, Jonas rode up with a telegram. He came in breathing hard and handed it to Clara without speaking. She read it again. She sat down. "What?" Caleb said. He was across the room and had her in 2 steps. She held up the telegram. He read it. The Cook County warrant had been suspended pending review. Father Donahue had gotten the documentation in front of a sympathetic clerk. More than sympathetic. It turned out a clerk who had herself lost a sister to a false accusation 2 years prior, and had been waiting apparently for exactly this kind of opportunity. The suspension wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't over. But it meant no marshal from Illinois was coming up this mountain. Not yet. Not before the circuit court hearing. 4 days, Clara said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "We have 4 days until the hearing." "That's enough," Caleb said. "It has to be," she said. He crouched down in front of her chair, so his eyes were level with hers, and he put both hands on her arms, and it was the most deliberate, unguarded physical gesture he had made since the night he put his hand over hers at the table, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her exhaustion, like light through thin cloth. "Listen to me," he said. "You have done more in 4 days than I have managed in 3 years. You are going to walk into that courtroom, and you are going to say what you know to be true, and it is going to be enough. Do you understand me?" She looked at him. "What if it isn't?" she said. "Not weakness, just honesty." "Then I'll still be here," he said. "And this land will still be here. And we'll find another way." His hands tightened slightly on her arms. "You are not in this alone. That matters." She held his eyes. "Yes," she said. "It does." The circuit court convened in the town hall on a Tuesday morning, and the room was fuller than Clara had expected. Word had gotten around. Word always gets around in small territories where land and water and railway routes mean the difference between prospering and failing. And there were men in the back of that room who had their own reasons for caring how this came out. Judge Elias Cortland was 62 years old, gray-haired, and had the unhurried manner of a man who has presided over enough dishonesty to recognize it on sight and enough genuine grievance to know the difference. He took his seat, looked at the room, and called the proceedings to order with a single knock of his gavel that cut through the noise like a blade. William Garrett was there. Clara had known he would be. He was not what she'd pictured, shorter, better dressed, with a professional pleasantness to his face that said he'd practiced it for a long time. He had 2 lawyers beside him, and he sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he did not look at her once when she came in. That told her more than if he had. Caleb sat beside her. Not behind her, not across the room, beside her close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, and she thought that was perhaps the most important thing he'd done in all of this. Just being exactly where she could feel him. Jonas sat in the row behind them. Sister Mary Catherine sat beside Jonas, her hands folded identically to Garrett's, but with entirely different implications. The proceedings began. Garrett's lawyer opened with smooth confidence, the kind of performance that costs considerable money, and delivered exactly what it cost. He laid out the complaint methodically, a woman brought to a remote location under irregular circumstances, an unmarried man with no family witnesses, a living arrangement that was improper by any standard of decent society. He was careful never to be crude about it. He didn't need to be crude. Implication was enough. Clara listened to all of it without moving. When Garrett's lawyer finished, Judge Cortland looked at her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you represent yourself. I do your honor. Proceed." She stood up. She had been a bookkeeper. She thought in numbers and patterns in the precise alignment of columns that either balanced or didn't. She had spent 3 weeks preparing this the way she prepared accounts, every figure in its place, every connection documented, every discrepancy flagged and explained. She presented it that way. She started with the agency letter. The original, and then the letter, Sister Mary Catherine produced from Garrett to Fenn, 18 months old, outlining the arrangement with Clara's name in it. She explained the timeline, Jonas's innocent letter, Garrett's hijacking of it, the deliberate targeting of a woman in Chicago who had discovered something she wasn't supposed to discover. She presented the account figures from Fenn's textile operation. Columns of numbers carefully transcribed from memory with the discrepancies marked. Not her accusation, the numbers themselves, which accused nobody and needed no editorial comment, because they were simply provably wrong in ways that pointed in one direction. She presented Father Donahue's written statement describing the pattern of false accusations against women employed by Douglas Fenn. 3 names, 3 cases, 1 employer. She presented the surveyor's report, which she'd obtained through Jonas from a clerk at the territorial office, who had been persuaded that the public interest was served by its availability, confirming that the Mercer land sat directly on the proposed railway route. And then she stopped. "Your Honor," she said, "I came to Utah Territory because someone put my name in a letter and told me I was wanted. I came because I had no better option, and because I trusted that the arrangement was legitimate." She kept her voice level. "I have since learned that my arrival was engineered by a man who wanted to use my presence, my reputation, my vulnerability, my lack of family connections in this territory as a weapon against a private citizen who refused to sell his land." She looked at Judge Cortland directly. "I am asking this court to look at the evidence and determine who in this proceeding is actually the victim of fraud." The room was very quiet. Judge Cortland looked at the documents for a long moment. He looked at Garrett's table. He looked at Garrett's lawyers, who had stopped looking confident sometime around the account figures and had developed the careful stillness of men recalculating. "Mr. Garrett," Judge Cortland said. Garrett's lead lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the documentation presented is—" "I was addressing Mr. Garrett," Cortland said. The lawyer sat down. Garrett looked at the judge for a moment. Then he looked for the first time at Clara. She met his eyes without expression. He looked away first. Your Honor. His lawyer tried again. The letter alleged to be from my client is unverified. It was held for 3 years by a woman of the cloth, Cortland said, who is present in this courtroom and available for examination. Are you suggesting Sister Mary Catherine forged it? A pause. No, Your Honor. Then sit down. The ruling came before noon. Garrett's complaint was dismissed. The filing was found to have been made in bad faith, and Judge Cortland used language in his ruling that Clara suspected was chosen deliberately. Language that would appear in the territorial record that would be available to any subsequent court that would follow William Garrett's name into every future proceeding he brought. He also referred the matter of Douglas Fenn's fraudulent accounts to the Cook County Federal Circuit with the documentation Clara had provided, and recommended the suspension of Garrett's land survey credentials, pending investigation of his arrangement with Harold Calloway, the territorial surveyor. He did not that day solve everything. Clara knew that. The Cook County case would take time. The warrant suspension was not yet a dismissal. Fenn was still in Chicago with his paid witnesses and his dry goods store, and his certainty that women like Clara didn't fight back. But he was wrong about that last part. And now there was a record that said so. Outside the town hall in the cold, bright air, Jonas grabbed her hand and shook it so vigorously she nearly lost her balance. Sister Mary Catherine touched her arm once briefly, with the precise amount of warmth of someone who does not believe in excess but understands its moments. Well done, the nun said simply. Thank you, Clara said. For the letter, for all of it. I held the letter because it was the right thing to do, Sister Mary Catherine said. You used it because you were the right person to use it. That's how these things work when they work. She looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly behind Clara in the way he'd taken to standing lately present close, not intrusive. Take care of each other, she said. Then she collected Jonas's attention with a look and moved off, leaving the two of them alone on the cold street. Caleb looked at Clara. It's not over, she said because she needed to say it out loud. No, he agreed. Fenn is still in Chicago. Yes. This could go on for months. The Cook County case, the warrant challenge. Clara, he said. She stopped. Come home, he said. Just that. Just those 2 words, simple and direct, and carrying the full weight of everything they'd built on that mountain over the past month. The second cup. The fence work. The grave behind the barn. The hand over hers in the firelight. All of it compressed into 2 words that meant more than most men could have said in 100. She looked at him. Yes, she said. The Cook County case resolved in February. Father Donahue and the clerk, whose name was Margaret, and who turned out to be formidable in ways that Clara would have loved to witness, directly assembled the 3 other women and their testimony and the account figures, and presented the complete picture to a federal judge who had been looking for grounds to examine Fenn's operation for 18 months. The warrant against Clara was dismissed with prejudice. Douglas Fenn was indicted on 4 counts of fraudulent labor practices and 1 count of filing a false criminal complaint. He didn't go to prison. Men like Fenn rarely did in 1883, but he was ruined, which was in some ways a longer punishment. His business licenses suspended his reputation among the Chicago merchant class, destroyed his paid witnesses, suddenly unwilling to testify for a man who could no longer pay them. Sister Mary Catherine sent a letter informing Clara of all this on a morning in late February. And Clara read it at the table with her coffee and Caleb across from her, both of them having developed over the months the habit of reading to each other the things that mattered. She read him the letter. When she finished, the cabin was quiet for a moment. It's over, he said. The Chicago part is over, she said. Garrett is still. His land survey credentials were suspended last month, Caleb said. Jonas heard this week. Without Calloway doing his surveys, his development plans fall apart. He can't move on the railway land without the surveys, and he can't get new credentials while the investigation is ongoing. He paused. He made an offer on the Perkins Ranch south of town instead. He's cutting his losses. Clara stared at him. You knew this, and you didn't tell me. I wanted to tell you after you heard about Chicago, he said. so they could be finished at the same time. She looked at him across the table for a long moment. "You planned that," she said. "Yes." "That was—" She stopped, shook her head, felt something warm and helpless move through her that she had long since stopped trying to contain. "That was very thoughtful. I've been practicing," he said. The corner of his mouth moved. The real smile more common now, less guarded. She'd made a project of it, without quite admitting that was what she was doing. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way he'd first covered hers months ago in the firelight. He turned his hand over and held on. He asked her in March, and he asked her badly, which was so perfectly consistent with everything she knew about him that she loved it completely. They were fixing the north fence. Of course they were fixing a fence. It was always a fence, and she was holding a post while he worked the wire. And he said without looking up from what he was doing, "I think you should marry me." She blinked. "You think I should?" she repeated. "Yes." "That's your proposal. I told you I'd get things wrong." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. "Caleb, I know it's not—" He stopped working the wire, looked up at her finally with the full open look, no guard, no management, just his face as it actually was, earnest and uncertain and entirely painfully sincere. "I know I'm not easy. I know this land is hard, and the winters are hard, and I know what I am. I'm not offering you something simple." "I know," she said. "But I'm offering you everything that's here," he said. "The land and the cattle and the 2 cups and—" He stopped. "And me. What's left of me, which is more than there was a few months ago because of you." He held her eyes. "Clara, will you stay? Not as a housekeeper. Not on a month's arrangement. Will you stay because this is your home?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had gotten on a train in Chicago with $11 and a forged letter and no idea what she was heading toward. She thought about the first morning, the axe in his hand, the single word "stay." She thought about everything that had been built in the space between that first stay and this one, the work, the danger, the trust, the terrible, slow, gorgeous accumulation of 2 broken people becoming something whole together. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He let out a breath. Long and slow, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a very long time. He went back to the wire. She held the post. After a moment she said, "You should know that for a proposal that started with, 'I think you should,' it was actually quite good." He made the sound she loved low, brief, real. The laugh that had been buried for 15 years and was learning slowly how to come back. "Don't tell Jonas," he said. "He'll want credit. Jonas will absolutely want credit. He can't have it." "No," she agreed. "He can't." Dent. They married in April in the mission school chapel, with Sister Mary Catherine presiding, and Jonas crying openly, and not apologizing for it, and the 4 chickens apparently audible from outside the window throughout the ceremony, which Sister Mary Catherine chose to interpret as a blessing. It was not a large wedding. It was not a formal one. It was a small, true thing conducted among the people who had, over the course of a very strange and difficult few months, become the closest thing either of them had to family. Clara wore a dress that had been sent from Chicago by Margaret the court clerk, who had taken it upon herself to do something kind for the woman whose account figures had helped dismantle Douglas Fenn's operation. It was blue, and it fit, and Clara wore it and didn't cry until Sister Mary Catherine said "beloved" during the ceremony. And she thought of the grave behind the barn and the wooden marker and the single word carved into it, and understood that beloved wasn't an ending. It was in the right hands, a beginning. Caleb held her hand through all of it and said the words in his low, rough, honest voice, and meant everyone. She told him about the baby on a morning in October. The aspens would have been turning, she knew that, without looking the same way. She'd learned all the rhythms of this mountain over the months. The way the seasons announced themselves before you could see them. She knew the cold in the air that morning, the particular weight of the sky. She'd known for 3 weeks. She'd been figuring out how to say it, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she understood the weight of it for him. A man who had lost one family. A man who had spent 15 years building a wall around himself against exactly this kind of hope. She said it simply the way she said everything that mattered. "Caleb, we're going to have a baby." He was at the table. He had his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at her. She watched his face go through things she couldn't name, not because they were hidden, but because they were too large for easy naming. Too many things moving at once in a face that had spent 15 years holding still. He stood up. He crossed to her, and he put both hands on her face, one on each side, gently, the way you hold something that is at once the most precious and the most terrifying thing you have ever been given. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he said finally. The same question he'd asked her in the courtroom. The first question always with this man. Not "what does this mean for me?" Not what happens next, just "are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said, and meant it completely. Something broke open in his face then. Not broke like damage, broke like daylight breaks, sudden and total and full of warmth after a very long dark. He pulled her in and held her, his arms around her, her face against his shoulder, and she felt him breathe one long, shaking breath, like a man who has been underwater for 15 years and has finally come up for air. Outside, the cattle moved in the lower pasture. The chickens made their noise. The mountain held the two of them the way it held everything steady, enormous, indifferent to human smallness, in a way that was paradoxically deeply comforting. The cabin that had been built for one, and had learned to hold two, would soon hold three. The two cups on the table were no longer a monument to solitude. They were the beginning of a story, not the end of one, the first small evidence of a life that had chosen against every odd and obstacle and elaborately constructed plan to the contrary, to open back up. Caleb Mercer had spent 15 years in silence, not because the silence was good for him, because he hadn't known yet what could break it. Now he knew. He held his wife and felt their child and listened to the mountain and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Everything that had been empty was full. Everything that had been ended had improbably and irrevocably begun again. The ranch was no longer a place where one man waited out his grief. It was home. It was loud with life and complicated with love and stubbornly, completely, joyfully alive. And that was enough. That was everything. That was at last the whole truth of it.